Hello and welcome to this Apac Pharma R&D webinar from Informa Pharma Intelligence, and thank you all for joining us today. My name is Ian Haydock, based in Tokyo as the Apac Editor-in-Chief for our Insights products. It's a real pleasure to have all of you and our distinguished panel join us for this event today. Pharmaceutical R&D is emerging from a turbulent couple of years as the COVID-19 pandemic threatened to blow it off course and forcing the industry to urgently respond to a global health crisis, whilst simultaneously changing many of the ways in which clinical development is conducted. As the world begins to get back to normal, what's been the overall effect on the drug pipeline? To help us with that question, Ian Lloyd, who's Senior Director, Pharma Projects and Data Integration for Pharma Intelligence, will first lead you through the Citeline Pharma R&D Annual Review, now in its 30th year. He will be presenting analyses of leading companies, diseases, mechanisms, and targets, and also drug types, and his session will also include exclusive APAC-centered content with a focus on the explosion of novel pharma R&D, which is now occurring in China. Immediately after Ian's presentation, we'll have a 15-minute Q&A session, so do please feel free to submit your questions through the webinar tool. Following that, we are very honored to have with us today an international panel of key opinion leaders representing APAC and India to discuss a number of questions around pharma R&D, again with an emphasis on issues facing companies in the APAC region. This will be a 45-minute session with no following Q&A. I will give more detailed introductions just before the panel, but we do have with us today Dr. Yan Shangjun from Fosun Pharma in China, Dr. Mukul Jain from Zydus Life in India, and Dr. Ken Lee from Syneos Health. Dr. Andrew White from Novartis, who was originally hoping to join us, is now not unable to make the session today and does send his apologies for not being able to take part. So for now, I'll hand over to Ian Lloyd, who oversees content and analyst services for our drug development solution and has authored the Pharma Annual R&D for more than 20 years, helping make this a must-have report for those seeking to identify the changing fortunes of drug R&D. So Ian, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Could you just confirm you can see my slides?
Yep, we can see those fine, Ian.
Great. So hello, everyone. Lovely to talk to you today. So as Ian mentioned, I'm going to basically split my presentation into two halves. The first half will be looking at the global pharma R&D pipeline in 2022, looking first of all at the new drug launches that were achieved in the preceding year, then looking at the total pipeline size for 2022, and then we have a series of analyses splitting the pipeline up and highlighting the top companies, the leading therapies and diseases, and the leading mechanisms and targets. And then in the second half, I'll be looking more specifically at the APAC and EMEAI regions, particularly APAC. And as Ian mentioned, focusing particularly on China. So looking at the Chinese companies, which hit the top 25 companies by pipeline size for the first time, looking at growth in R&D across the APAC region, and picking out some key highlights for APAC and some for EMEAI as well. And as mentioned, we'll have some conclusions and questions at the end. So let's start off by looking at the global pharma drug R&D pipeline in 2022. And let's start with the good news, the success stories, if you like, the new active drug substances that were launched during 2021. By a new active substance, we mean a new chemical or biological entity where the active ingredient had received no prior approval for human use. So this excludes about 75 other drug launches last year, which were reformulated or non-NAS moieties or biosimilars. The graph shows you how many new active substances were launched each year from 2001 to 2021. And you can see that in 2021, there were 97 new active substances launched across 95 products. And this is because 2 launches were of combination products, which had 2 NASs in each. and it also includes 13 vaccines, which you can see by the grey bar. To get a better handle on the trends, it's very informative to look at 5-year means in terms of number of NAS launches, and this really shows that new launch numbers are accelerating. The 5-year mean hit a new height between 2017 and 2021. The mean was 63 drugs per year versus 42 seen in the 5 years before that, and it's more than double that seen in the noughties. Breaking down the data a bit further, you can see that 17 new active substances were first in class, by which we mean a drug with that mechanism has not been brought to the market before. 30 had orphan drug status, and cancer, as we'll see in a second, was the most popular therapeutic area. AstraZeneca, the most successful company with the most new active substance launches. So breaking down the new active substances by therapeutic area, as I mentioned, cancer has the biggest share. You can see 30% of the drugs brought to the market for the first time targeted cancer, and this included 3 first-in-class drugs. Anti-infectives came in second after having a surprising, well, not surprising, but an unusual lead in 2020 when COVID suddenly brought them from way down the field to be the leading therapeutic area in that year. But they're still in second, so still getting a bounce from the COVID pandemic. And of course, this number includes 11 COVID vaccines, and it also included 7 agents for use against COVID across 6 products. Again, there was one combination product. Alimentary metabolic came in third. Where was the first market of choice for these new active substances? Well, not surprisingly, the US is still the most popular choice for the first market, being the largest market in the world. But only 45% of new drugs made their debut in the US in 2021, considerably down on the 54% seen in 2020. And here's where we see the first mention for China. China is now accounting for 19% of drug debuts. This is a huge increase up from the 9% seen in 2020. And all but one of those new active substances were locally originated, so drugs developed by Chinese companies. In China, over 60% of the NASs were targeted against cancer, and it has overtaken Japan to be the leading Asian country for drug debuts, and it pushed Europe into third place. Very quick summary of those 17 novel new active substances. I won't go into read out the whole detail on this slide here, but just to highlight, there were 3 in cancer: Amgen's Lumakras, Merck & Co.'s Welireg, and Rhizen Pharmaceuticals and TG Therapeutics Uconic. There were 3 in the metabolic area, so BioBridge Pharma's Nulibry, Eiger Biopharmaceuticals Zokinvy, Lexicon Pharmaceuticals Zynquista, and 2 anti-infectives fit the NAS definition. Pfizer's Paxlovid against COVID, and Takeda and GlaxoSmithKline's Liv-10-City, which was against cytomegalovirus. There's a big amount of autoimmune inflammation and dermatology new active substance novel drugs. AstraZeneca's Safnalo, Remegen and Rongchang's Tai-A, Hansen Biopharma's Idefirix, ChemoCentryx's Tavneos, Apellis's Empaveli, Leo Pharma's Adbry, and UCB's Bimzelx. In CNS, there was just one, the most probably controversial drug of the year, Aduhelm from Biogen Eisai, and there's probably enough for a whole webinar to talk about that, so I won't go into that further on this one. Cardiovascular, we had Regeneron's Evkeeza. As I mentioned, AstraZeneca was the most successful company in bringing new drugs to the market in 2021, launching 5 new active substances. This included its COVID vaccine and also a dual monoclonal antibody therapy against COVID. 4 firms managed to launch 3 drugs. Of these, Bayer was the most successful in terms of having the best launch to pipeline size ratio. And Roche is the only one in the top of the top 10 pharma companies which failed to launch a single drug during the year. But you'll also notice here Chinese firms making their mark for the first time, with 4 Chinese companies launching 2 drugs apiece. And Guangzhou Pharmaceuticals had the best NAS to pipeline size ratio overall. So having looked at the number of drugs successfully brought to the market, let's take a look now at the actual pipeline as a whole. And by pipeline here, we mean we cover drugs from early preclinical development, so as soon as they've been disclosed, provided they are in development by a company rather than an academic institution, and they have a therapeutic focus, all the way through the various stages of clinical trials, through the pre-registration and approval phase. And this number also does include some launch drugs. We still count them as being in the pipeline if they're still under development for additional indications or additional countries. So you can see the headline figure at the start of 2022 had beat 20,000 for the first time, and that the pipeline size has grown by 8.2%. This was an expansion on the rate that we saw in the previous year, where the pipeline size only grew by 4.8%, and it's above the 5-year average of 6.3% per year. This year, there were 1,500 odd more drugs in development than there were previously, but this kind of actually hides what's really going on here. Actually, during the course of 2021 to 22, we identified and added to the database nearly 6,500 new drugs versus only 5,500 the year before. But there were also over 4,500 which left the pipeline. So this shows you that out of this 20,000 figure, there's a huge amount of churn in a single year of drugs entering and exiting the pipeline. Across the entire pipeline, for new drugs, 39% were anti-cancers, nearly 15% neurologicals, and 12% anti-infectives. Here is the breakdown of the pipeline by phase. So we're looking at the global development stage here, the furthest a drug has got in any country for any disease and by any company. And you can see that, not surprisingly, the preclinical pipeline is the biggest tranche, but it's also shown the biggest increase. So there are 11% more drugs in preclinical development this year than there were last year. Phase 1 also grew significantly, up by 10.1%. The later clinical stages have also shown increases, with phase 2 up by 6.4% and phase 3 by 8.7%. The phase 3 number is particularly significant because while we've seen the phase 1 and phase 2 numbers increase year on year, really virtually every year since we started doing this research 30 years ago, phase 3 has really struggled in the last few years and has been flat for a number of years. So the fact that we are now seeing 8.7% increase in phase 3 is very encouraging. It does show that we're starting to get over the bad attrition rates that we see at the end of phase 2. Here are the top 10 pharma companies by pipeline size. You'll notice there's little change in the top 10 this year from last, with Novartis spending its 6th year at the top. And in fact, the top 4 are entirely unchanged. The only change to the cast of the top 10 is that Lilly re-enters the top 10 at the expense of AbbVie. But you'll also notice that most of the pipelines are actually shrinking, with only AstraZeneca and Sanofi and Lilly growing. And AstraZeneca's increase can largely be attributed to its acquisition of Alexion. But overall, it was actually another quiet year for mergers and acquisitions amongst the top 10. Sanofi and Merck & Co did buck the trend by buying 6 and 4 firms respectively. Sanofi brought Kymab, Tidal Therapeutics, Cydis Pharma, Translate Bio, Cadmon Holdings, and Origin, while Merck acquired OncoImmune, Pandion Therapeutics, Velos Bio, and in the year's most significant deal, Acceleron Pharma. But against this backdrop, 4 of the top 10, Roche, Takeda, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Johnson & Johnson, stayed out of the M&A game completely. Overall, we reported 116 mergers and acquisitions across the year, down quite a bit from what we saw in 2020, where there was only 142. But I think the interesting thing to notice here is the fact that despite we have that 8.6% increase in the pipeline size across the board, the top 10 are actually showing decreases or are very flat. And we can look into this a little bit further. So on this graph, what we've done is we've added up the number of drugs that the top 10 companies have provided overall and expressed as a percentage. And the top 10 is now only providing 4.6% of all drugs in R&D. And that's down from 5.3% last year. And you can see the rate of decline has increased somewhat. In fact, it was over 13% in 2011. That's the pale blue line. The bright pink line is looks at the top 25, and again the top 25 is contributing less of the pipeline than it was 10 years ago. It was nearly 19% in 2011, and it's now down to 8.5%. The dark purple line shows you the percentage of the pipeline which the really small companies are providing. So these are companies with just one or two drugs. And you can see that was in 2011, that was around 15%, and now it's around 17%. It's been fairly flat for the number of years. It actually declined a little bit for the first time for a while. So this would suggest that the big increase that we're seeing in the pipeline overall is largely being fueled by companies more in the mid-range. The total number of companies with active pipelines is also increasing. There are 6.2% more companies involved in R&D this year than there were last year, bringing us 5,416 companies in total. But again, this number masks a huge amount of change within a single year. So we actually added over 1,000 new companies to the database during the year. So this means that a net of 725 left pharma R&D, either because their drugs failed, or maybe they're acquired, or quite often we see companies go into hibernation mode where nothing happens for a while. So 19.2% of all of the companies involved in pharma R&D currently emerge in the single year just gone, which is, I think, a fairly extraordinary statistic. And over half of the companies are tiny. There are 759 companies that just have two drugs, and around a third of all companies that we're covering have just a single project. 1,883 have a single project. Let's move to look at the pipeline by therapeutic area. And here you can see the broad therapeutic areas and how the pipeline stacks up there. So cancer has been the biggest therapeutic area. If you ignore the biotechnology bar, which is not really a therapeutic area, it's more kind of a kind of drug. So cancer, you'll see on the second set of bars, has now 39% of all drugs having an oncology target. That's up from 37.5% 1 year ago, and significantly up from 29.5% 10 years ago. And the cancer pipeline grew by 14% this year, so really bucked the trend, way ahead of the 8.6% overall pipeline expansion figure. Neurologicals came in second, but they were slightly under that overall pipeline expansion percentage with just a 7.8% increase. Anti-infectives were in third, but they were only up by 4.7%. And this is a much slower growth rate than the huge 22.4% anti-infectives saw in 2021, due entirely to COVID. So it just showed that things are starting to kind of correct after the big COVID bounce for anti-infectives. Let's move away from the broad therapeutic areas and now look at individual diseases. And here you can see the top 10 individual diseases or indications for which drugs are being developed. Cancer obviously is very dominant here. It takes 7 of the top 10. Breast cancer remains the leading disease, but its growth has stalled, and it has almost exactly the same number of drugs in its pipeline this year as it did last. This is allowing non-small cell lung cancer to catch up at number 2. That had a 11.5% pipeline expansion, so a very much bigger expansion than we saw with breast cancer. COVID, which was obviously a new entry in our chart last year, a new disease, so we created a new indication for it, that entered the charts at number 5 last year, and this year it's up again to number 3. Whether this will be its peak, we will see. But it has expanded by 22.4%. And in fact, COVID vaccines are just outside the top 10 at number 13. Cancer, in fact, had 15 of the top 25 overall, so not just 7 of the top 10. And we also see a small rally for Alzheimer's disease climbing back up the charts. And this could be a result of the Aduhelm approval reigniting interest in this disease. We now look at the top 10 mechanisms of actions or pharmacologies. Now, the system we use in pharma projects to classify drugs is hierarchical. So this means there are broad hierarchies, broad terms at the top of the hierarchy, and then you go down to more specific terms. And what we do tend to find is that when we first identify drugs, we often don't have information about their specific mechanisms of action, so that they can only be ascribed a broad mechanism term. So this is why you'll see broad mechanisms dominating the top 10. The top one of all is the immuno-oncology therapy classification we use, which has grown by a further 14.8% this year. But the column, the penultimate column to the right hand side shows you the percentage of each of these drugs with these mechanisms which are in the latest stages of development, either at pre-registration, approved, or launched. And you'll see, despite there being 3,300 odd immuno-oncology drugs in development, only 2% of these have got beyond the clinical trial stages so far. So it does show that a lot of faith is being put in this strategy, which is still relatively new. There are other immuno-oncology related rises in the top 10, with checkpoint inhibitors up by a third, and the CD3 agonist entering the top 10 with a nearly doubled pipeline size. You also see more advanced therapeutic terms entering the top 10, with gene editing and gene expression inhibition advancing. And there's a new entry for a new term we created this year for another new hot area, protein degraders, which enter at number 8. Here we look at the individual drug proteins that drugs are targeting. And again, cancer and in particular immuno-oncology targets are dominating. We've got a new number 1 in the chart this year with the CD3E molecule, and this is a key target for bispecific antibodies. So this is now the protein which more drugs are hitting than any other in the pipeline. There are other immuno-oncology related rises in the top 10, with PDL1 up to number 2 and CD19 and PD1 also up. And you'll notice that the top 10 are all cancer targets. And this is quite a change to 5 years ago, when the opioid mu1 receptor, which is a target for pain and constipation, was actually number 1. So it really shows the revolution that's happening with oncology. There's also an interesting return to the top 10 for the 5-HT2A protein, and this is largely due to the fact there were just a huge amount of new drugs hitting this target identified during the 2021-22 period. Obviously, you can't do a presentation about pharma R&D without talking about COVID these days. So what we've done here is we've looked at the number of new entities against COVID that we added by month since the pandemic started. And what you see here is the pink bars represent direct antivirals, the grey bars represent vaccines, and the pale pink bars represent complication therapies. So you can see here that the graph almost follows the first wave of the pandemic, with the peak being in April 2020, when there was a huge amount of new drugs and vaccines identified against COVID. And you'll see in the second year that things have definitely fallen back a bit, with new complication therapies falling back in particular. But new vaccine R&D has been sustained across the 2021 period. We may well see further declines as we go into 2022, and the focus may switch to antivirals a bit more. Another big trend that we've noticed over the years is the increasing focus of the industry on rare diseases. So this graph will show you the number of rare diseases which pharma R&D is targeting in total year by year. And it shows you that there are now 677 different rare diseases which there are drugs under development against, up from 648 last year, and it's almost double that which pharma R&D was targeting in 2014. The number of drugs against rare diseases is up too, with over 6,000 drugs in development for at least one rare disease, up from 5,608 last year. and this now represents 30.2% of the pipeline. So over 30% of all drugs are being targeted against at least one rare disease. So that concludes my look at the pharma R&D trends overall. Now let's look more at APAC in particular and EMEAI, and see if we can identify some exciting trends in particularly APAC, where a lot is happening very quickly. It was really a landmark year for Chinese pharma R&D, with phenomenal growth taking pharma into the big league. We saw Chinese companies entering the top 25 companies by pipeline size for the first time ever. Jiangsu Henry was at number 16, up from 37 the previous year, with a 71% increase in its pipeline size. Shanghai Fosun was at number 23, up even more from number 66 the previous year, with a huge 127% increase in its pipeline size. And there was a third Chinese pharma company just outside the top 25 at number 26, Beijing. And as we saw, China was now the first market for 19% of new active substances, up from 8.5% in 2020. And 3 Chinese companies delivered more than one new active substance: Jiangsu Henry, Guangzhou Pharma, and the Remagen Rongchang combination. So China originated new active substances are really beginning to make an impact for the first time. Here we look at where companies are headquartered in the year to break out and find out where R&D is happening in terms of where companies are based. And Chinese HQ companies have risen by nearly 50% in a single year. So China now accounts for 12% of R&D firms, and its share has leapt up from 9% in 2021. So the number of Chinese headquartered companies rose by 43.3% in a single year, which is quite phenomenal, I think. So it's now sitting at 792, up from 522 in 2021. So obviously, when you do a pie chart, there's someone's got to lose out if someone is gaining ground, and it was the US and Europe which ceded ground here, with the US losing 2% share down to 44%, and the rest of Europe down 1%. Looking at APAC HQ companies, China now posts 4 out of the top 10 APAC, but Japan still has the biggest companies. So Takeda is more than twice the size of any other APAC headquartered companies. However, its pipeline has shrunk. And if you look at the table here, you'll see it's China where the increases are. Only the Chinese companies are showing rises, whereas the Japanese companies are all flat or in decline. And if we look back across the previous decade, again, I think the picture is even more striking. What you can see here is the number of headquartered companies by country by year. So obviously that bright pink line is China, and it shows really how the number of Chinese companies involved in R&D is soaring, approaching 4,000, and it only passed 1,000 4 years ago. So pretty phenomenal. Meanwhile, you'll notice the grey bar for Japan is pretty flat. In fact, it actually showed a slight decline in 2022. But something that may not be so apparent to everyone is that actually South Korea is also doing really well. The light pink line you see there has shown that it's not increasing at quite the rate that China is, but there's a very significant increase going on there too, and it's also doubled in the last 5 years. So that was looking at the companies by where they're headquartered. What about where R&D is actually occurring? So on this table, we're looking at the number of drugs and looking to see in which countries we are reporting clinical trials, preclinical development, or other R&D. You'll see the US then is still obviously preeminent, with over half of all drugs in development having some development activity in the US. But China has become the second most important market. It goes up to number 2 now, with over 4,000 or 20% of all drugs are now in some kind of R&D in China as well. And South Korea, you'll notice in this table, has also moved ahead of Japan. Now, diseases that companies are focused on differ by region. So we saw earlier on how breast cancer is the most popular disease for drug development overall, but actually in most territories it's non-small cell lung cancer. It's only the fact that NSCLC is actually not so popular in Africa that makes breast cancer the overall winner. You'll notice here the top 8 diseases in China and the Oceania region overall are cancers, with in both cases non-small cell lung cancer first and breast cancer second. And there are some differences if you look elsewhere, with type 2 diabetes in the top 8 for Europe, Japan, and the rest of Asia. In fact, it's the third biggest priority for Japan. And you'll see rheumatoid arthritis popping up there in Europe and also in Africa. It's interesting to look at the Africa figures and note just how different the priorities are in that continent, with 5 infectious diseases in the top 8. So given the particular issues in that continent, not surprising maybe to see HIV, AIDS and tuberculosis in their top 8 diseases. We also took a look at the what we'd like to call advanced therapies, so kind of the more cutting edge types of therapies. So what I've done here is I've split the pipeline by biotech, non-biotech in the first set of bars to the left-hand side, and you can see the overall pipeline in the strong pink figure. The Apac figure is in the grey, and the EMEAI is in the pale pink. So looking at biotech overall, the split is around 44-45% in the world, APAC and EMEAI, so pretty similar. We also did the same thing for rare diseases in the second bunch of bars, and you'll see here that EMEAI region has a greater focus on rare diseases than the global average, and APAC is actually rather behind on rare disease R&D. Then if we look at cell therapy, you'll see that APAC is actually above the global average. So a big focus on cell therapy in APAC. But in the final set of bars in gene therapy, APAC and EMEI are slightly below the global average. So at the conclusion of this presentation, what are our thoughts? Well, we can see that pharma R&D, despite what could have been a very difficult couple of years with the pandemic, is actually going from strength to strength, with pipeline growth having been accelerated in 2022. There are more drugs and more companies, more diseases and more targets being studied than ever before. And it was a record year for new drug launches in a single year, with the record set in the previous year when, let's not forget, COVID was at its height, being smashed yet again. So very, very positive news here. And in the APAC EMEAI region, China is obviously the big story. Chinese companies are joining the top 25 big pharma club for the first time. And now 12% of all companies in the world are headquartered in China. There's been a big rise in Chinese companies, but South Korean ones too. 20% of all drugs are in R&D in some form in China. And we also saw that the EMEAI region is strong on rare diseases. So as we kind of return to normal, I think there's a very positive outlook for pharma R&D. Already in the first quarter, there were 12 approvals for new active substances. So whether 2022 can beat the 2021 record again is maybe doubtful, but the year started well. And I think we can all agree that APAC is set to grow even further in terms of importance. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. And I think I'm going to hand back to Ian Haydock, who's going to pick out some questions from the chat for me.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ian, for that presentation. I know there's quite a lot of data to unpack there, but it really is very remarkable, I think, to see the emergence of the APAC R&D and innovation that's really come about through the last few years. So thanks very much for all that. We are getting some questions through in the chat, and so we do have about 10 minutes or so for Q&A. So everybody, please do make use of the question tool within the webinar to submit your questions. And in the meantime, Ian, I'll ask you one that's come in from a BD manager in China. And the question is, given the limited funding and resources available and ever-growing competition, what would be the key strategy to prioritize R&D portfolios to maximize the chance of surviving and being competitive in the years to come? That's a big question, but maybe you have some thoughts on that.
It is a very big question. I think definitely the focus on rare diseases is one of the strategies that companies are adopting, particularly because they can charge a huge amount of money for them. So if you get a rare disease therapeutic to market, there may be a very small patient population, but there are huge sums of money still to be earned. Obviously, cancer is such a big focus at the moment, and the immuno-oncology, it really is a revolution, immuno-oncology, I think. If we're finding these drugs working in combination, if you are developing an immuno-oncology drug, you can do lots of clinical trials looking at combinations of your drug and your competitors' drugs, and that may get you to market sooner. It is a big question. I think if I knew the answer to that, I'd probably be very rich because I'll be speculating on the stock exchange, but which unfortunately I'm not. I think the trends that I highlighted really are kind of showing you where companies are looking, and obviously that these are the areas which they believe can deliver the most success for them.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
think, Ian, from my side, maybe I'll just add one thing to that, if that's okay.
Sure.
I think those are certainly very hot and important indications or disease areas. But I think then also for one company or one organization, for your asset, is to really pursue a global development program. It's now possible to commercialize globally. By yourself or to find partners to do that. You need a global development program in order to get through the regulatory hoops for everything. But if you pursue a global market, that opportunity is obviously bigger than just, say, staying within China itself. I think that would be another thing I would add.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're seeing with as we saw 20% of drugs globally in R&D in China. They're not just Chinese originated drugs. Obviously, there are a lot of I think a lot of Western companies probably ignored China up until maybe the turn of the millennium, but now they're obviously developing drugs there and wanting to get them approved globally, not just in the traditional Western territories.
Yeah, and likewise for Chinese companies in not just China, but also in the US and the EU.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're having quite a few more questions coming in now as well, Ian. So an interesting one here is that obviously the report is looking at different ways of analysing and comparing the innovation that's going on globally. But this specific question is around, is there any angle to analyse and compare the quality of innovation except for the number of NMEs? Is there any other kind of metric that we could maybe use to do that?
We kind of focus really on quantity and recording the information that comes in. It's difficult for us to make qualitative assessments. The way the Pharmacologies database works is obviously we collect information from all the publicly available sources, from the companies, from journals, from conferences, and we just collect the information and report it. So we don't make a qualitative assessment. Informa Pharma Intelligence does have another publication called Biomed Tracker, which does look at the likelihood of approval for drugs, and the analysts in that team do actually make a more considered assessment. So that might be a good place to look if you're interested in trying to identify the drugs that are most likely to succeed, which are in the pipeline, which will be one measure of quality maybe.
Okay. Another interesting question here is that, given the emphasis that there is at the moment on biologics and gene therapies and so on, do you still think that low molecular weight compounds still have a chance to become blockbusters?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What we've seen in the last kind of 20 years or so is the percentage of drugs under development which are biologicals just creep up year by year. So we saw there is nearly 40% now, I think. But that still means that 60% of drugs in R&D are not biologicals. They are small molecules. So there is definitely scope for such drugs to become blockbusters. Alzheimer's obviously a bit of a controversial area in the past year with the monoclonal antibody there. But if someone could develop a small molecule which definitely had efficacy in Alzheimer's, they're going to make an absolute mound of money. So yeah, it's definitely not the case that biologicals are the only game in town now. There's still a role for small molecules, but we're just seeing that percentage of small molecules just being eroded very slightly year on year. So there probably will become a tipping point, I would say, maybe at the end of this decade, where we may see biologicals become the majority for the first time. But that may not happen. We'll have to check back and see in future years.
Okay. We will discuss this topic a bit more in the panel session, but another person is asking here, what could be the reason for the sudden growth in Chinese companies' R&D pipelines? What are the factors that make them competitive next to the US? What are your views on this explosion that we've seen in research coming out of China?
Yeah, so I think there's two things happening here. The one is the kind of the genuine increase in there, and let's not forget, like at the turn of the millennium, there were very, very few Chinese companies developing novel pharma R&D. It was much more traditional medicines, generics, etc. So yeah, there's something massive happening here. I think over the last couple of years, there is also a bit of a reporting bias here, in the sense that we here at Pharmacologies and in former pharma intelligence overall realized how important China has become, and we've actually set up a lot of new processes to identify and track new drugs a lot better than we used to. So we have analysts on the ground now in the Greater China area. We're tracking the NMPA websites and all the clinical trial registries. So there's definitely some effect of better detection on our part in China, particularly in the last couple of years, I would say.
Okay. Turning to EMEAI region now. Question here is, what do you think accounts for the relative strength of that region in rare disease R&D? I think some of the data you presented shows, companies in that region are fairly strong. Is it related to legal and market incentives? And if so, does Asia need to think about setting up similar frameworks going forward?
Yes, it probably could be. Obviously, the US and the EU and various other kind of Western countries have long established orphan drug status programs and various other ways to accelerate drugs in development for very niche diseases. I'm not an expert on similar activities in China or Asia, but definitely that obviously has encouraged R&D in rare diseases in those countries that have those kind of schemes in place.
Okay.
I think, Ian, for me to...
Sorry, yes, go ahead.
I was just wondering if I could just add on that question around the explosion of China. I think, and I know that there is better observation from you all, but the other thing is just the capital markets. Access to capital has been also very easy for Chinese companies. If you just look at the number of IPOs in both the US as well as on the Hong Kong stock exchanges, there's just been a high level of interest, and that's why it's driving clinical development and new projects, but also the establishment, as you've seen in your data, of so many new companies, right? I think that in itself is also a key factor in terms of driving things exploding China.
Thank you, Ken. All right, I think we've got time maybe for a couple more questions. The RNA drug trend, obviously we've seen so much activity around the mRNA vaccines for COVID, but what are your thoughts on the RNA drug trend more widely, globally, particularly US, EU and Asia, from the data that you've seen? Any particular trends in that area?
Yeah, so the various different kinds of RNA therapeutics is definitely on the increase. Maybe not as increasing as much as they were in the years just gone by, but things like small interfering RNA, mRNA, antisense, these strategies have seen limited success so far. I think it would be fair to say there aren't that many antisense drugs on the market, even though it's been a strategy for quite a long while. So I would say there's increasing interest still, but maybe it's starting to plateau a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Are you seeing that spill over into the things that the synergistic areas in, like, I mean, when Moderna was speaking about combining it with the flu vaccine, having a flu vaccine, things like that? Is that the second logical place to go to with a very high probability of success?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, the new vaccines that were brought to the market due to COVID, obviously didn't happen overnight. It was kind of fortunate that those technologies were coming to fruition at exactly the right time. But there's huge potential to broaden those approaches out to other infectious diseases for sure, and maybe other kinds of diseases too.
Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll need to make this one the last one. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We will have a list of the questions, and if possible, we will try to respond to those after the event. But for now, we'll just have one more, Ian, which is about research and development in the CNS field. This has maybe been somewhat neglected over the past few years, but any thoughts about where do you see the trends going in this area particularly?
Yeah, so CNS is still a big area. We saw earlier on how it's still the second biggest area after anti-cancer, but I think it's fair to say that the pipeline expansion in CNS has been below the overall pipeline size for a number of years, and I think that is largely due to lack of success in that area. Whether Aduhelm will ultimately be a success is obviously extremely debatable. There's a huge amount of challenges involved in the CNS area still. There are lots of diseases such as Alzheimer's which really are very poorly understood. So I think it's at a bit of a crossroads really. I think the basic science needs to probably improve to really give the CNS the shot in the arm it needs.
Oh, okay. All right, many thanks for the presentation and the Q&A session, Ian. Much appreciated. And we'd now like to move on to the panel discussion part of the webinar, for which we are delighted to have a truly international and distinguished set of guests. So let me first do some detailed introductions. Dr. Yan from Fosun, as I mentioned earlier, has multinational experience and is currently the head of R&D strategy and portfolio management at Fosun's Global R&D Center. And he's in charge of R&D strategic planning, disease strategy, portfolio management, licensing in, project evaluation and review, and assessment of new R&D technology. Dr. Jain is president and head of non-clinical R&D at Zydus Live, and is also president of the Zydus Research Center in Ahmedabad, and responsible for new drug discovery and development. He was the key person responsible for Saroglitazar and Desidustat, the first NCEs from an Indian pharma company, and has also contributed to the discovery and development of 16 other NCEs. So Dr. Lee from Syneos is Apac Regional Head Executive and Vice President of Clinical Development at Syneos, and has held leadership roles in clinical and commercial operations and medical affairs for both CROs and biopharma companies. And he leads the Asia Pacific Clinical Solutions business across 13 countries and has extensive international and pharma company experience. So welcome everybody, and thank you again for taking part in the event today. I have a feeling that we're going to have a challenge keeping the discussion to 45 minutes. I know we've got quite a lot to cover. So what I'd like to do is start off with a bit of a blue sky question, I would guess. And this would be, what would you identify as the single biggest challenge for global pharma R&D at present from your individual perspective? So I'd be interested to hear everybody's views, try to narrow it down to a single key issue. So perhaps, Dr. Jain, we can start with you.
unmute myself. Am I audible to you?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think, as you can see from the presentation, there is a shift towards the orphan diseases, and I think one of the reason, in my opinion, could be because the larger diseases. I mean, when we started research, um, everybody used to focus on diabetes, dyslipidemia. I mean, antibacterials before that, so hypertension. So those are larger diseases which I believe with number of molecules getting approved, the major unmet needs have been fulfilled already. So there is a challenge now to identify the molecules which take care of the remaining unmet needs, and that's why the companies are finding new targets with the new possibilities of addressing the leftover unmet needs in larger indication. Unfortunately, those may not give a blockbuster potential, because if you're addressing only a specific need, then you may not get a large market share. Whereas the orphan diseases, because there is a huge unmet need, and these are some of them are really serious, uh, one can still develop effective molecule and get much better price as compared to what they will be able to achieve uh, with the other larger indications, because the incremental benefit that is needed for the other indication is really challenging to fulfill, because you need to identify new targets which take care of those needs. So these are the, I think, major challenges. There are few diseases which are like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which uh, Alzheimer you mentioned. These are still big diseases where unmet needs are there, but it's very challenging to identify the molecule that gives the desirable therapeutic benefits. So these are the challenges, in my opinion. From larger indication, there is a challenge to fulfill the unmet needs, and for orphan diseases, I think there is an opportunity. So you are seeing that companies are focusing on developing drugs for orphan diseases mostly, and looking for small biotech companies to come up with the specific molecules targeting new mechanisms which will give us a better uh, therapies for the larger indications.
So, Dr. Yang, you may have a different, slightly perspective from your point of view, working for a major Chinese pharma company. What would you identify as the single biggest challenge for global R&D from your point of view? Are you able to hear me okay, Dr. Yang?
Yes.
Okay.
But I missed the question because there's some around 13 seconds delay. So I missed the question. So it's about the bigger trend?
Yes. So the question was, from your point of view, what you would identify as the single biggest challenge for global pharma R&D at the moment?
Okay. So from my perspective, I think relatively low productivity, this is a big issue. The reason behind is that we all know that the discovery of disease targets, design of new molecules, and verification to define the available patients. That's the three most important things to bring out innovative drugs. I think the fundamental reason is that verification must be put in comparison with existing standard of care for those major diseases, but the threshold is high and become higher. So that could be, say, comparing the input side and the output side. It's really don't match. So I think relatively low productivity is the big issue.
Dr. Lee, any thoughts from your perspective? You maybe have a slightly different take on things.
Yeah. Well, I normally come from a more operational perspective, given where I'm working at, and operationally the challenge for global pharma R&D. I think for me it's just like with on the commercial side, it's market access. For us in clinical development, it's access to, but access to patients and access to talent. Access to patients, I mean, as you've presented today, Ian, the rare disease studies are obviously on the increase. These are patients that are hard to find, difficult to identify, and to recruit, and that leads to the productivity challenges around how long it takes to run a study. There's also the even outside of rare disease, a lot of the studies like in oncology are very much looking for a selected population, biomarker driven, and so on. So the number of inclusion exclusion criteria is dramatically increased, so it's that much harder. And as you've seen this rapid rise, as you presented in terms of studies, just the site capacity, right? Enough investigators, the research infrastructure that they have in across the world, but also here in Asia particularly. I mean, it's hard to sort of grow that to be able to do and run studies, right? And then access to talent, at least from our side, but for also other CROs, other local pharma companies. It's hard to get talent. It's hard to get contract research associates to monitor your studies. It's hard to get project managers, and you need this type of individuals to run the study. I think at the moment, I would say that that's a talent war pretty much globally. It's probably hotter here in Asia Pacific. So if you don't have that, your study is it's gonna be a lot more difficult to run, right? But naturally, I'm not sure if there will be a question around that, but there are new things that are evolving in this space as well around recruitment, using technology, and so on, which maybe we can discuss later. But that's helping to address these challenges. But to me, operationally, these are the two biggest worries.
Thank you. So I think we've seen with the pandemic, quite a massive shift in the speed of R&D, and it's kind of shown that with enough financial and regulatory support, that development timelines can really be massively speeded up. I mean, obviously, we've seen such quick approvals for vaccines in the US. We've seen some amazingly rapid approvals in Japan of products, within a matter of days, in sometimes. So I'd like to ask the panel what you see as the main issues that we can take forward from that. Obviously, it's been shown that it is possible to speed things up considerably, but this has been an emergency situation. But what could we possibly take forward from that experience more permanently? So perhaps I'll open that up to you. First of all, Dr. Yan, your thoughts on that?
Okay, so the pandemic, clearly it has a very fast-forward impact. My observation is that the fast-track approval definitely accumulated several, let's say, successful cases by the authority. And from that perspective, looking to the future, it could be become more good example and for other cases. So that's really a good thing. And the second thing I would say is a weakness. There are so many or even redundant study rushing to the area simultaneously. So there was no national level coordination to do some assessment of which one should do, which one should not. So to put on the priority. So we can say here some of the trial finally did success, but it get delayed or a little bit delayed. But most of them end up with no result or just postponed. So that could be in the regular time. We don't need that kind of coordination. But in an urgent situation, or sometimes some area become overheated, you do need some coordination on higher level. And even going to the enterprise pharmaceutical company, they need to do some assessment and evaluations. If it is too overheated, don't go into that area. So that could be a good big lesson both to the authority and also to pharmaceutical companies.
Dr. Jain, from your perspective, obviously we've seen some changes in India as well, but are there any thoughts that you have perhaps around the particular approach there that might be able to be taken forward by the regulatory authorities? Hello, Dr. Jain. Did you manage to hear the question okay?
No, can you repeat again? I had a small interruption in my internet. Yeah.
Okay, yes, no problem.
Yeah.
A few technical issues. Okay, no problem. So the question was around the lessons perhaps more locally in India that we've seen in terms of regulatory and policy activity during the pandemic that maybe could be taken forward a bit more permanently, and whether you had any views on the changes that perhaps could be made.
Sure. I think pandemic has made a significant difference to us, and our company, as you must have known or seen in the press, that we developed a DNA vaccine for COVID-19, and what we learned from this experience is that first of all, the government's view that there is a importance to be given to pharmaceutical innovation was very high. I mean, I think the government realized that the pharmaceutical companies need to be given very high priorities, and accordingly, a lot of things got changed in terms of regulatory path. The speed of regulatory approvals was extremely high, and I think there was a support from government, and they actually government played a role like a partner in discovery and development of products. At the same time, there was a financial incentive and support. On the technology front, I think COVID made a major change in the way the regulatory meetings were held. Everything was online, which saved a lot of time. In fact, the number of meetings were too many, and the government supported the discovery and development at different stages of the process. So these are I think several changes that happened because of COVID, and I think many of them can be sustained. For example, the digital use of digital technologies as an enabler for rapid approvals and regulatory process is really a nice change that has happened. um, Government's incentive and support to pharmaceutical industry has been a major change that has happened, and I think I believe in future, whenever any disease of this kind comes, there will be a high priority from government, and there will be a support from government to the industry. So I think these are some of the changes that have happened primarily because of COVID, and we saw approval of the vaccines in India in less than 2 years. I think 1.5 years. I think that is unprecedented, and one could not have imagined until this thing happened. So these are positive things that happen, and both from the changes in the regulatory process and also the adoption of the technology, the digital platform. So those two changes are really there, and I believe they will be sustained.
So, Dr. Lee, perhaps from your perspective, you might have seen also quite a lot of changes globally and in the region. So are there any thoughts that you have on this issue?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Yen made a really great comment about better coordination around governments and authorities. I think that would be nice. That there may be some redundancy and duplication of efforts around the COVID vaccines and of the like. However, I think that the world is probably even more fragmented than it was before COVID. I think, and I'm not sure how realistic this is. It's going to be, although it's a really great point. The speed of approvals, I think it was, that it obviously showed that in a crisis we can do it, and I'm sure we should have another one, touch wood, we will be able to match it. But a lot of these approvals were very strongly driven by crisis, right? Having an emergency use authorization, basically just stopping every other kind of study for COVID study, right? More or less, so to be able to match that kind of speed in day-to-day life is not, I don't think, possible. And as we go back to indications that were kind of, on hold a little bit in the COVID time, I think what we're seeing in our data is that startup times are migrating back to a more what we've seen previously. However, I think one thing that's probably going to change, to Dr. Jane's point, is the methodology of the studies are probably going to, there will be an acceleration there, right? The acceleration of decentralized trial methodologies, risk-based monitoring methodologies, having a lot of this done back at the home. I think this is all developing now, and using digital for e-consent, e-clinical outcome assessments, home nursing and home procedures. I know it's still sort of in the process of change here in Asia Pacific, but the focus on that, the willingness to do that by the ecosystem was certainly a lot. It's just a lot stronger today than it was pre-COVID, right, where it was still prefer to do things in a traditional site-based manner.
So perhaps sticking with a related question is, I think we saw in Ian's presentation that there's been something of a resurgence in anti-infective R&D, which has obviously been driven in part by the pandemic. But I'd like to ask the panel whether you see, besides the policy and regulatory sphere, whether you see any permanent shift coming out of the COVID pandemic around the therapeutic focus of R&D for the industry as a whole. Is the interest in anti-infectives going to continue? Are there going to be other areas that are coming out from the pandemic, such as obviously the mRNA technology sphere? So perhaps we can stick with you, Ken, initially. Your thoughts on that, please?
Yeah, so on anti-infective, Ian, I think my answer to that is I don't know. We still see a lot of leftover COVID work still being done. And I do feel that there's definitely more interest in anti-infective as a therapeutic area. I think it was languishing before COVID came. Whether it'll be sustained, I'm not 100% sure. That's why I asked that question around whether mRNA is being pivoted to other infectious disease areas. Haven't seen that much of it yet, but I hear a lot of talk of it. So I think that's why I'm not really sure yet. But there is still sustained. I mean, it's only 2-3 years out, but whether that will continue long term, it's hard for me to say right now. But I think that certainly certain indication of oncology to me still remains to be so critical, and the growth and the activity that we see in the space on a day-to-day basis is just phenomenal, and I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. That's it from my side.
Okay. Dr. Yan, I'd be interested to hear from your perspective whether the pandemic has had an influence, you see a broader influence globally on R&D focus, or perhaps even at your own company. Has it reawakened an interest in anti-infectives or any other area or any other type of influence that you've seen?
Okay, I think the focus of the big area are still oncology, immune disease, CNS, rare disease, etc. COVID-19 cannot change the development landscape by whatever means.
Yeah.
But from my perspective, COVID-19 does stimulate higher interest, at least in the academic domain. There are still many unclear or unknown aspects in terms of biological mechanism of viral replication, pathology effects, or immunodamage. Or even to a broader scope, the coronavirus. We know that some wild animals are the hosts, so we can never rule out the possibility that some viral strains of these species may potentially evolve to coexist among animal and human beings in the future. So I think the sense of get prepared could be even stronger. So, and we go back to say this time Pfizer, their drugs. I think they have already studied in 2 or 3, but the SARS was there. So get prepared. It could happen, but you get prepared next time. So you are well advanced. So I think that could be very interesting what you observe. So that's it.
Okay, any thoughts to add on that, Dr. Jain?
Yeah, I think anti-infective research would get some prominence, in my opinion, because for a long time the antibacterial research has been under pressure, and from commercial point of view, it had too many companies. It remained unattractive because many companies started antibacterial programs and then found that it's not enough attractive. But at the same time, we also had been talking about emergence of resistance, um, and hospital acquired infections, which are particularly uh, demonstrating resistant pathogens which are not treatable by the available antibacterials. So we had been talking about antibacterials, particularly for resistant pathogens, but now we also know that the antivirals are important. Um, and today we are talking about SARS-CoV-2, but there is always a threat of another virus to emerge, Ebola virus, Zika virus, or so many other threats have come in past, and I think fortunately they never pose such a big challenge to the humanity as SARS-CoV-2 has done. But there's been a growing realization that we should be prepared to face another potential threat to humanity from either some bacterial pathogen, bacterial strain which is resistant to the available antibacterials, or a viral threat that can spread very fast. So there will be a need to get ready. So I'm sure pharmaceutical companies uh, would work again on the antibacterials, antivirals as and in fact large anti-infective as a area of research. And so I mean the SARS-CoV-2 has only demonstrated the urgency and the need to work on this area.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a slightly different topic now, and I'd be very interested to hear the panelists' views, perhaps more specifically around the markets in which you are operating. And the questions are really relating to whether you see any particular bottlenecks or constriction points, and also advantages to conducting R&D in your particular home territories. So this might be a question that relates to policies, regulatory systems, but are there any advantages and disadvantages? For example, if a company is looking to conduct R&D in India or in China or elsewhere in Apac, to be very interested, I think, and a lot of people on the call today would be very interested in hearing your views on the pros and cons of conducting that research. So perhaps, Ken, we could move over to you for perhaps a broader view, perhaps within the APAC region, and what you see as the plus and minuses of doing research here.
Yeah, sure, Ian. Happy to kickstart. So I think for the region, a lot of the key big markets that you reported on, China, Japan, Korea, there's often a need for some sort of local data to get registration, to get market access, to commercialize. So and these pharma markets are growing, tremendously. So, to that previous point around global expansion, I think that if you want to come and commercialize in Asia Pacific, you're still going to need to do a trial here, and that's a strong reason to come. Another strong reason to come is if you do a global study, especially now it's hard to find patients and that kind of stuff. So apart from having that diversity in ethnicity, you also need to find more sites to recruit, more patients to recruit. So I think that's another reason to come to Asia Pacific, that it's a very populous region across here. And I think the challenges, I think that I've covered those previously here because of the explosion and interest to come to Asia Pacific. Access to the infrastructure to run your studies is challenging. Access to talent to run the studies, access to patients and sites and so on. There's just so much competition going on, and I would say it's fair to say that there is more jobs than there are people. In clinical research is a kind of a good thing to have, but it also represents difficulty to run studies.
Dr. Yan, I'd be interested to hear your views on China, because obviously we've seen a lot of positive regulatory and policy changes in China over the past few years, Dr. Yan. So I'd be interested to hear your views on the situation for conducting R&D in China at the moment. Obviously, as Ian showed in his presentation, we've seen an explosion of R&D in the country, literally within the past few years. So, what do you think are the factors behind that? And, are there any emerging bottlenecks within that area now?
Okay. I think the rising cost from every step of the study, this is really, really
Ian, can you hear?
I think it's not audible to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say I can't hear Dr. Yan as well too myself.
Dr. Yan, I think you may be muted. I'm sorry. We seem to be having problems with your sound.
Okay, so it's now clear. Let me say again. Let me continue. I think the second very big level of issues that the translation of medicine still offer very limited, let's say, guidelines on what are those potential sensitive patients, those who may show higher or broader side effects. That could be the preclinical stage of study of omics biomarkers are still need to be more productive. So that be a very big issue today to China, but maybe not specific to China. Probably to other regions may also exist. So that's my view.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yan. So, Dr. Jain, maybe you have some views also on the situation in India. Obviously, perhaps India is at a slightly different stage of the R&D process, but are there any particular plus or minus factors that you see within the environment in India?
Sure. I think Indian environment is certainly different than West and China, maybe Japan. India has been a very price sensitive market. And the reason is that, the India has traditionally been a generic pharmaceutical business. And we are that's why we are so called as the generic pharmacy of the world, because we have, maybe 20,000 different companies, pharmaceutical companies, and it's a very competitive market, and most of the products are manufactured by multiple companies, so the prices are very low, and that's the reason why we have been able to get a good capture of the Western market, in particularly the generic pharmaceuticals. Now, I think that's why the expectations from the investors and the population at large is that the prices will be low. Now that becomes a problem when you become innovator. The expectations that you will bring out innovative products and supply them at a very low price. And one of the reason for this expectation is that because the Indian patient have to pay from their pocket. The payers are not that many in India. It's not really a culture that people get the insurance coverage. So when it comes to innovative product, one cannot really think of pricing it like a generic medicine. And this there has been a pressure on the innovative company, and that's why innovative companies are not finding enough incentives for spending money on drug discovery and development. Many companies in the beginning, they started the drug discovery R&D, and they found a alternative as a out licensing opportunity. And many companies out license their early discovery products and created that as a model. Our company, on the other hand, we decided to develop molecules till the launch, and of course, to meet the expectations from the Indian market, we have been pricing our new and the NCEs little low as compared to what one would get from a Western market. But at the same time, we are also expecting that and we will be able to develop these products for global market where we can price it differently by making some changes in indications or the formulation or something else. So there, I think we have adopted a different model. India as a country, I think, is facing this challenge of the price. Unless government support innovation and allow higher pricing through some mechanism that the companies are incentivized. Otherwise, company will find this difficulty. So this is a different model, and that's why many companies have not been able to sustain their drug discovery R&D. Although many started, they had a good pipeline, but eventually many closed their R&Ds. We are sustaining because we hope that we will be able to launch our products eventually in the US and the European market, and we have started that as a strategy. And once I think the Indian market is seeing some successes, if we are successful in generating much higher return on our investment, then I think it will open up opportunities for other companies to consider the same model.
Thank you, Dr. Jain. I'd like to move on now to looking in a bit more depth at China, because as we saw from Ian's presentation, with the emergence of many Chinese companies and R&D. And I'd like to ask Dr. Yan again to share some of his views around the rapid emergence of China as a global R&D force. Obviously, we have seen a few setbacks in that push recently with some of the regulatory decisions in the US. But I'd be very interested, and I think a lot of the participants would like to know in a bit more detail what's really been the key factors behind the emergence of China as a global pharma R&D force. So Dr. Yan, if you could just make sure that your mic within Workcast is unmuted. I think we had a few issues hearing you last time. Hopefully they won't continue. Okay. Yep. Okay, can everybody hear Dr. Yan at the moment?
Thank you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I think there are three major driving forces behind. First wave of driving forces came from the government.
I can't hear anything, Ian. I think this is a pretty important answer here.
Sorry, Dr. Yan. We seem to be having audio problems. Just explaining that we are trying to run a parallel system at the moment because of technical issues earlier. So we are connected to Dr. Yan within Teams, but also within the Workcast platform. So we're kind of running two parallel meetings. Dr. Yan, if you could make sure that your mic within the Workcast is unmuted.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I think that's fine now. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So
yes, please continue.
Okay, so if you can click here, I think the webcast working works better. I repeat it. I think there are three major driving forces behind. Two already there. The third one we have to observe. The first driving force came from the government since 2015. The authority put in place new regulations and policy for your registration and drug quality control, clinical trial guidance, etc. This bring to the high level complying with the international standards. So overall, China has already had transparent, reliable international level regulation and policy system. So we can say we observe that since 2015, there are so many, new company, biotechs has already been set up, and a huge sum of investment funds rush into the area. So, and the second thing, I think the second driving force, I think, come from the industry. So China has already had a relatively complete value chain of R&D, for example, CRO, CDMO, etc. And they also have plenty supply of qualified talent from the university or even from the multinational company. Those they have R&D experience both abroad or in here in the branch of multinational companies. And I think the third also including the investment. There's so high motivation from those PE funds, whatever. They push a lot of money into pharmaceutical industry. So this is basically two major driving forces. Looking into the future, I think from the Chinese government, they view biopharma as one of the strategic innovative industry, and this is the key component of the national strategic competitiveness. So they definitely have the interest to try to make an innovation-friendly ecosystem, including law or reimbursement, talent attraction, etc. I would imagine that the third driving forces might come within the next 5 to 10 years, but this time maybe mainly from the university or research institute. I know many of the university, particularly the leading university or research institute, they are conducting basic studies. So maybe within the next 5 to 10 years, they may bring new, let's say, drug targets or even new technologies. So that I can imagine within the next 5 to 10 years, the original innovation may arise on the landscape. That's all.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to open that up a bit more. Perhaps, Dr. Lee, you might have some views as well from your perspective on that.
Dr. Yan, I have. Can you hear me now?
Yes,
we can hear you, Dr. Yan. Yep. Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so
Thank you.
I just make an answer, but I'm not sure whether you heard me.
Yes, we heard it all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes, over to you, Dr. Lee, if you had any further views to add on that important issue.
Yeah, so I totally agree with Dr. Yan that the Chinese market R&D productivity. I mean, we also believe that's going to continue to be very, very vibrant. I mean, it may sort of cool off a little bit here. I think in the issues that were raised in companies like Innovent, Junshi, HUTCHMED trying to go to the US, and the FDA sort of requesting a bigger, more diverse phase 3 trial. I think that's going to pour a little bit of cold water on things. There are about another 25 assets that are in a similar position, so it'll be interesting to see how they continue to vote there. But in talking to our customers here in China, I think the interest is still to continue to do a global development, to be able to commercialize globally. There may be some small setback in terms of now, okay, maybe they have to repeat the study. There's some prioritization of portfolios, raising capital for that. But there's still very strong interest to continue to grow there. I think we'll probably see bigger multinational studies, big multi-country studies being done, global studies being done to match this particular need. but we do feel that that's still going to continue. It would be interesting to hear what Dr. Yan thinks from a capital perspective, though. I think now with inflation, rising rates, and things like that, whether that's going to put a little bit of a slowdown for access to capital for Chinese biotechs. But I think a lot of the big companies like Fosun are still very well funded, so they're probably not have much of a slowdown in this period. Yes, but I think overall, in spite of these challenges, Ian, that you raised, getting to the US and so on, we still feel that there's going to be a tremendous amount of growth still, maybe at a more moderate pace.
So, Dr. Yan, did you have any views on that, whether there might be a potential slowing down in access to capital and whether that might be a risk factor going forward for the Chinese industry?
Sure. Currently, I think there kind of we've said the big reason is that the first batch of biotech company they adopted the model fast track. Speed is everything, but overall the innovation level is not so high. Last year in July, the CDE, the authority, stipulates a new regulation, so-called clinical value-oriented clinical trial for oncology drugs. So for the first time, the industry all get a very clear message or information from the authority that redundant kind of clinical trial, there could be very big uncertainty in the future from the reimbursement side, or even if you want to do conduct the clinical trial, you have to put a comparison control, and that could be, it's no longer as the way you did before. You have to choose those drugs, they're already in the standard of care. So that put the hurdle much higher. So then the industry, I think both from the pharmaceutical company or biotech or even the funds, they understand that this time, if you want to do the study, you have to raise up the bar more innovative. Not only you just follow a trial, a multinational company already in phase 2 or phase 3. This time you'd better put in to follow those in preclinical. So overall, you have to take high risk. So the uncertainty is much higher. But calculating the time. So all those new type of biotech, they just start from last year, since July last year. So we have to wait for at least next year. Those companies, they bring their project to the clinical trial. So for those funds, for the investment, they are very eager to support this type of companies or project. Yeah. But for the moment, all those company, the first wave of biotech, they were set up before last July. I think overall the value is not so high, so they walk away. So that could be currently the investment is not high, but I think the investment are very eager. So we just wait next year, go on those company, leading company with high innovation, definitely respond well. They are very welcome to this type of company.
Oh, that's great. Innovation solves everything.
So I think we will have to make this the last question, given the time is moving on. I do feel we could carry on chatting for another hour at least. But Dr. Jain, I'd just be interested to get your views on, talking about innovation and how you see, what's the Indian industry's views on innovation. Do companies have an appetite for pursuing this? And, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier also, I think Indian companies did have had an appetite for innovation. Different kind of innovation. We are talking of drug discovery, but when most Indian companies think innovation is applied in all the aspect, formulation, development, the API research, and also drug discovery, the NC research. And as a result, most companies who spend on the R&D, their R&D get divided. So that I think most companies, they divide the risk um, in different baskets. The total R&D spend of all the Indian companies will range, I think, about 8 to 10%, 7 to 10%, but it get divided um, because of different kind of risk associated with uh, the innovation of drug discovery versus generic versus API or formulation. So the appetite is there, risk appetite is there, but the approach of Indian company is a balanced approach. So they will spend in R&D, but the R&D get divided, the investment get divided. So as a result, the drug discovery do not get as much of spending as a large MNC or small biotech companies who depend mainly on the discovery products. I mean, so there is a difference. A large pharma in US would spend almost everything on the development of a new product. The small biotech, they have nothing else but to develop a new product. But Indian companies are largely generic companies, so they would continue the generic product development. At the same time, they would definitely like to switch gear and get into the truly innovation space. That's the NC and new biologics, etc. But at this moment, the investment get divided, and I think I hope that when the discovery products start bringing back the revenue to the company, then they will be spending more on the new drug discovery research than what they are currently spending. So there is definitely interest in innovation. Every company talks about innovation today, but innovation of different kind. Innovation in generic, innovation in new drug discovery, innovation in formulation, innovation in product development. So this is the current scenario, and I think I believe, as I said earlier, they are looking at some successful drug discovery examples where company would make a lot of money from the drug discovery products, and then probably the innovation would switch towards drug discovery, uh, and that looks promising. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jain. All right, I think we'll have to bring things to a close there. Unfortunately, I do feel we could carry on much longer, but I would like to say a big thank you to all of our panelists today for taking part and exploring some of these fascinating questions, and also to everybody that joined us today for this webinar. So thank you very much, and take care, and bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye-bye.